Robby, let's get started. What is on your radar?
No, I almost did a radar on how much I dislike Zoran Mamdani.
Oh, no.
But instead, I decided to start the week on a more conciliatory note.
Save my feelings.
Here we go. So, no one ever said Donald Trump lacked creativity. The president is clearly concerned that the Supreme Court could rule against his widespread use of tariffs to engage in diplomacy with countries the world over, and has come up with an idea to make them more popular with Americans. Trump is promising to pay every American, except those who are already very wealthy, $2,000 per person. Trump wrote this on Truth Social. People that are against tariffs are fools. We are now the richest, most respected country in the world with almost no inflation and a record stock market price. 401ks are highest ever. We're taking in trillions of dollars and will soon begin paying down our enormous debt. 37 trillion record investment in the USA. Plants and factories going up all over the place. A dividend of at least $2,000 a person, not including high-income people, will be paid to everyone. Well, this idea comes at a moment where Trump's tariffs, well, they could be in jeopardy, constitutionally speaking. The Supreme Court is currently hearing arguments regarding a case that will decide whether the president has the power to unilaterally impose tariffs without action from Congress, now under his broad emergency powers. Last week, the SCOTUS justices seemed skeptical that the president possessed this power. A key moment came when Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch asked whether the president could use these same emergency powers to impose tariffs in other contexts. Take a listen.
Could the president impose a 50% tariff on gas-powered cars and auto parts to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad of climate change?
It's very likely that could be done. Very likely.
I think that has to be the logic of your view.
Yeah, in other words, obviously this administration would say that's a hoax, it's not a real crisis, but...
I'm sure you would.
Yes, but that would be a question for Congress under our interpretation, not for the courts.
That was the sound of every properly conservative American dying a little on the inside. Now, I don't care how much you love Donald Trump. If the president can declare tariffs on that basis, then just imagine what Democrats will do when they get back into power. Now, as for Trump's latest scheme, $2,000 for every American sounds like a great deal. When will the checks be in the mail, I wonder? But don't get too excited. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent clarified that these cash payments to Americans could take many forms. Here he was explaining the policy to the media over the weekend.
The $2,000 dividend could come in lots of forms, in lots of ways, George. It could be just the tax decreases that we are seeing on the president's agenda. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, deductibility of auto loans. So, those are substantial deductions that, are being financed in the tax bill.
But here's the problem. Now, while it certainly sounds good for every American to receive a check for $2,000, the revenue raised from tariffs comes from, well, all of us. Tariffs are, in fact, a tax on the American people. Foreign countries don't pay them. Foreign firms don't pay them. The cost of the tariff is paid by the importer, no matter the good or the product or the resource or the service in question. Whoever is purchasing the tariffed item, whether it's Japanese cars or South American sugar, that's the party who pays them, the purchaser. That party then passes that cost on to domestic consumers by raising the price that they're going to charge when they sell it in this country. All of the revenue raised by the federal government vis-a-vis tariffs is being collected already from the American people. So seen in that light, the true light, the idea of the U.S. receiving some of that money back in the form of checks, well, that's a bit absurd. The tariff revenue was collected from us in the form of higher prices. Skip the checks, just get rid of the tariffs and watch prices fall. Now, conservatives, if they're being honest with themselves, know that the best way to have a healthy economy is to have a federal government that is maximally hands-off. It is not a conservative agenda, but a socialist agenda, a Zoran Mamdani agenda, perhaps, that wants central government control over the economy in the form of vast regulation, price fixing, and taxation. Tariffs are taxes. Conservatives know this. The Supreme Court knows it too. So with respect to those $2,000 checks, thank you, Mr. President, but no thank you. Just cut taxes, cut tariffs, watch the magic of the market economy go to work.
Well, I'm going to skip over your gratuitous jab at Mr. Mamdani and move on to the substance of your argument. As you know, you and I have broadly similar views on the tariff question. I think that there are some isolated examples where they could be justified. I don't think you think they're ever justified, but the general thrust of your argument, which is that they're a tax on everybody, I do agree with that. I was also scribbling notes as you were going through your radar there, and just some of the things that struck me were, for example, Trump tweeting about 401ks being their highest ever. Of course, 401ks very much linked to the stock market. That's not at its highest ever because of tariffs. In fact, tariffs in terms of the Liberation Day tariffs sunk the stock market by quite a significant amount, and then they rallied, the markets rallied back as Trump gradually pulled back from the tariffs. The Supreme Court case, I think we discussed briefly last week, but it does seem to me of a piece of Trump's tendency to just declare emergencies in various ways as a way to get around whatever the existing laws or practices or guardrails are. And then Scott Bessent making that argument, well, it could come in many forms. I just laughed.
Good feelings.
Good feelings, good vibes.
Yeah.
$3,000 of good vibes for everyone.
I'm very concerned that the Republican Party, the Trump administration, Trump himself, frankly, is not at this moment paying close enough attention to affordability and the general economic situation being such a chief concern of voters. It should not be surprising that this is the chief concern of voters. This has remained now the chief concern of voters for a long time. This is what sunk Biden, the perception that his policies had contributed to inflation. They had not gotten inflation under control. They were in denial about the extent of the inflation problem. People were seeing the sticker price of goods at the grocery store staying high and blaming Biden for that. Trump comes into power and does not, and I'm not like unfairly critical of the guy. I don't try to slam him left and right. I've had some positive things to say about the foreign policy agenda of the administration. The domestic policy agenda is gone awry because these prices remain high and people are still feeling that pain. And that's not actually surprising, again, given the tariffs and some other policies. This is a case where I love to disdain economic experts or experts in any field as much as anyone else, but the economic experts all said if you do this kind of thing, it will hurt the market, it will hurt affordability, and they did it anyway, and this is what has happened. It's persisted to hurt.
Yeah, and the Trump people take refuge in the idea that some of the predictions for inflation were higher than they've turned out to be. But it's still the case that inflation at 3% on an annualized basis is pretty much exactly where it was when Trump came into power. Given the centrality of that issue to his election, as you point out, it's obviously a problem for him that inflation has not been curbed in any significant way at all. And so we see when it's broken down, when his performance is broken down according to various topics, you see basically his worst marks on inflation. And I think that goes to some of the points you were raising.
It's really frustrating that the administration, almost on some very basic level, doesn't seem to understand that when you say, whatever it is, car parts from Canada cost 20% more, that means the price of cars, things we're buying here, goes up accordingly, just in a very basic way.
Yeah, not that hard to understand.
Yeah.
Robby, what is on your radar?
Well, Niall, Barstool founder Dave Portnoy appeared on CBS News over the weekend claiming that anti-Semitism is on the rise. The popular sports and politics commentator is Jewish and said the number of racist insults he receives on a daily basis has dramatically increased. Take a look.
I've seen in my own experience, just being Barstool, the difference between how much hate I get. I mean, occasionally you get, hey, or Jew or whatever. It's every day now. There's a definitive shift in what's going on. So yes, now I for me, being a Jewish person, you gotta step up. You're kind of someone people look up to in the Jewish community. You have to be like, all right, this is not normal, with the guys. People are coming in with real hate.
His comments follow a viral instance of anti-Semitism in which someone screamed "F the Jews" at Portnoy on the street in broad daylight. Let's watch.
Wait, Why come in the camera, buddy? Why? Come here. Come on. Come on. Come on.
I shouldn't be allowed to make those jokes, right? I should be putting handcuffs. That's what you said.
No, handcuffs. No, you can
That's
joke.
what you said.
to be clear, it's totally fine to hate Dave Portnoy, but F the Jews? Now, I'm highlighting that incident because it is notable, in my view. This was not an internet comment from some random faceless troll. We all receive unpleasant and occasionally vile feedback on social media from accounts that disparage people for all sorts of reasons, race, gender, sexuality, and so on. But usually the would-be insult hurlers are a bit more restrained in person, where they can be identified, named, and shamed and suffer adverse impacts, loss of job, etc. In fact, the person who screamed that was arrested. Now, in other words, I think we need to face a really uncomfortable fact. Anti-Semites increasingly feel empowered to express anti-Jewish animus in public. Their intolerance has been branded as edgy, cool, and contrarian, and ultimately acceptable, and that's a very, very bad thing. Now look, I realize it can be a bit grating to listen to rich and famous and powerful people like Dave Portnoy complain about how they're being treated. I, for one, think if you make a living as a commentator, you just have to deal with the fact that people are going to utter obscenities at you. It comes with the territory. Pundits, like myself, who obsess over how frequently they've been threatened or have often lost their sense of proportion of how entitled they seem. Furthermore, pundits who complain about, for instance, racist or misogynistic feedback are often merely objecting to the fact that their commentary has grown stale. It is no longer resonating with their audiences. So these complaints can also serve as an invitation for censorship, i.e., my critics are viciously attacking me, and therefore social media CEOs and/or Congress must silence them. And look, we all know how that turns out, so let's set all that aside. For all those reasons, I'm personally highly resistant to arguments that online hate represents anything particularly real or that a certain kind of animus or prejudice is increasing. On just the anti-Semitism front, we've been treated year after year to claims by Jewish advocacy groups like the Anti-Defamation League that the picture's always getting a little bit worse. These groups can be like the boy who cried wolf. The lesson of that story, though, is not that all wolf warnings are false. Indeed, there eventually is a wolf and it kills all the sheep. Similarly, I am deeply troubled by how much casual anti-Semitism I am encountering on both the right and left these days. And when I say anti-Semitism, I mean actual anti-Semitism. Not criticism of Israel, not disagreement with U.S. support for the war in Gaza, not fervent objection to the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's true that people who criticize Israel, oppose war, and dislike Netanyahu have been smeared as anti-Semites by bad faith defenders of the status quo, of unlimited American aid to and support of Israel, no matter its policies. Unfortunately, we are well beyond that now. It's not just criticism of Israel, it's criticism of Jews. In fact, Jews are being held responsible for the policies of Israel, whether or not they support them. Nick Fuentes, a would-be thought leader of the young right, holds the Jewish people in contempt because he disagrees with Israel. He doesn't just hate Israel, he hates the Jews. He's gaining ground, which means that conservatives can no longer pretend that anti-Semitism is confined to the left. It is absolutely, definitively present on both ends of the political spectrum. Here was Senator Ted Cruz calling out anti-Semitism on his side recently. Take a look.
In the last 6 months, I have seen more anti-Semitism on the right than at any time in my lifetime. It is rising on the right, and it is dangerous. And if we look away, if we refuse to denounce it, if we are scared of it, it could destroy the Republican Party just like it has destroyed the Democrat Party. I think we have an obligation to stand up, to speak out. Many elected Republicans are terrified to say anything. And I think this is a moment where everyone decides, where do you stand? Are you willing to stand up and speak the truth? And it is going to matter in the coming years whether our party and even more fundamentally our country survives.
I agree with him. I've seen it too. Now, to be absolutely clear, no one is being called on to defend Israel or to defend Netanyahu or to defend American tax dollars being sent overseas. I definitively oppose that. Conservatives are being called, however, to reject prejudice against a race of people, the Jews. This is because collective punishment and race-based identitarianism are anathema to conservatism. Modern conservatism is an individualist philosophy that has its roots in classical liberalism, a philosophy that emphasizes equality of just that, individuals. Not race-based equality or group-based equality, but liberty based in the dignity of every individual. My intellectual hero, Ayn Rand, once said that the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. Now, she was saying this to the left as an explanation of why progressive defenders of minorities should prefer individual rights rather than group identity-based understanding of rights. But that saying should apply to these new anti-Semites as well. these anti-Semites on the right. We must defend the equal rights of all people, Jews, blacks, women, and so on, all the groups of people that Fuentes hates, by the way, because they're all individuals, and individuals have rights. Not countries, not governments, not groups of people based on bloodline, but individuals. That is the ideology of the right, and that is why it is incumbent on true conservatives to purge the anti-Semites, the actual anti-Semites, not mere Israel critics, from our midst.
That's pretty good, Robby. I don't really disagree with any of that. I mean, I think you did draw a definite line, as we all have to, between criticism of Israel or criticism of particular Israeli politicians like Netanyahu and prejudice, of which anti-Semitism is obviously one form. And there does seem to be an open, or a more open, expression of anti-Semitism, particularly in the case of Fuentes. But generally, I mean, it's very rare for me to agree with Ted Cruz, but what he said in that clip, I would have no issue with. I do think that part of this mix is the way, unfortunately, defenders of Israel or defenders of Netanyahu have sought to paint any criticism as anti-Semitic just straight off the bat.
I absolutely agree with that.
And that's a big problem.
I absolutely agree with that. And I've seen that.
Yeah.
And I've called that out. And so I understand if you're coming at this from a totally neutral vantage point, being suspicious of these complaints of rising anti-Semitism because you are used to having just perfectly legitimate opposition to what Israel's doing, an opposition I share, being painted as anti-Semitism. I've seen that. I have borne the brunt of that. People have hurled that at me. So I get it. But this is very different. This goes well beyond that. It is a simple hatred of Jewish people and a blaming of all the Jewish people for what Israel's doing, even if they object to it. I know many Jews who object to the Netanyahu government. No,
absolutely. And there does also seem to have been a unfortunate resurgence of tropes that are plainly anti-Semitic, that essentially the Jews control everything. Right. The Jews are pulling the strings, all of that stuff. That I think is very toxic and very dangerous indeed. And we, whatever our political views or our views of Israel's conduct, you have to push back against that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Enough is enough.
Robby, get us started. What is on your radar?
Well, affordability, affordability, affordability. That is the word on everyone's minds. I'm glad I pronounced it correctly 3 times. Democrats performed well in last week's elections by focusing on this very theme, which encompasses housing availability and inflation and education costs and childcare and healthcare and so many other things that we're talking about. Now, when they discuss affordability in vague terms, Democrats are even able to avoid the toxic infighting between their progressive left and their moderate factions. No need to relitigate democratic socialism as long as you're sticking to high grocery prices, rent, and so on. The right, the political right, needs to come up with its own answers in terms of the affordability crisis. Here was conservative news host Ben Shapiro offering up one view.
If you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up, but the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity. And if the opportunities are limited here and they're not changing, then you really should try to think about other places where you have better opportunities.
Oh, Ben. Now, I like Ben, and if you've been watching Rising these past 2 weeks, I'm taking his side an awful lot in the so-called Groyper Wars, the Tucker-Fuentes feud, whatever we're calling it. And I even agree with him, if you want to get technical about it, that voting with your feet is the best response for young people to dwindling economic prospects. It's absolutely true. If New York or California are becoming unaffordable or unlivable because of failed progressive policies, then try out a saner city, or the suburbs of a city in the Sun Belt, or the Midwest, where I'm from. This is a viable option for more and more young people as work increasingly does become remote. That has downsides, but one of the upsides is this. Now, I know living in an expensive city can feel like a must, and for many young people in certain fields like national media or politics, it is a must. But there are a lot of careers that can be done perfectly well from home, from remotely, in a comparatively affordable suburb. Go give it a try. If you like it, get married there. Start a family. It can be a good option. Shapiro is also right that this has been the American experience since the founding of our great nation, even before. As more land became available to the West, Americans moved that way in search of new frontiers, opportunities, and they formed communities there. We should channel the spirits of our ancestors and do the same. There's a great, comparatively empty interior for this country that's just waiting to welcome young people seeking affordability. The political figures who run those areas should work to make them more enticing to young people. Now, all that said, Shapiro's advice probably sounds like a bit cold and unhelpful for the many, many young people who are frustrated with the Trump administration and perhaps the GOP more broadly for failing to deliver on concrete policies that will make life easier for the people who voted for them. In fact, Shapiro has had this argument before with Tucker Carlson, who made the following point.
If you wake up one morning and you find yourself in a society where 23-year-olds with four-year college degrees and like initiative who aren't smoking weed every day, if they can't make enough to buy a car, much less a home, much less get married, much less have children, then why should you be surprised when half of them say they prefer socialism?
Now, that debate took place almost a decade ago, and I think Carlson's point probably resonates with quite a few young people. So let's not be content to say, go west, young man. If we're going to make things better in the here and now, the GOP must champion affordability. We can't yield that to the Democrats. Thankfully, the answer to the affordability crisis is for the GOP to deliver on the promises it's been making for years or even for decades. For instance, the higher education system is not working for young people. College has become an expensive credentialing system that wastes some of the most productive years of young people's lives, fails to prepare them for relevant work, and then straddles them with unsustainable debt. Let's scrap all that. The federal government should stop subsidizing student loans, which have only encouraged universities to raise tuition. Instead, compel the universities to lower their tuition if they want to qualify for research dollars. How about that? If anybody's paying off the debts of college students and graduates, it should be the colleges themselves, not the taxpayers. Making housing more affordable, even easier. Just build more of it. Build, build, build. Build more housing. We need to vastly expand the supply. Cut red tape, kill off zoning laws, ignore the complaints of NIMBY neighbors who are afraid the tall building will ruin the village's precious rustic charm. No, we're done with all that. Same goes for food prices. We know why they're out of whack. Not enough trade. The administration has been too focused on using tariffs for perhaps justifiable national security reasons, but the consequence is everything's becoming too expensive in the here and now. GOP voters might punish the party come midterms if the administration doesn't pay better attention to their concerns. Young people in particular might punish the party. A lot of concern is being paid to older voters to make sure they still get Medicare and Social Security. You know who isn't getting entitlement right now? Gen Z. Trump overperformed with this generation in 2024. He certainly owes them something. And Niall, that's in the background of this sort of ideological feud taking place between Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, those type people, and Ben Shapiro and others on one side. You know, it's about Israel and anti-Semitism and racism and other things, but it is also about a frustration that disproportionately young conservative men have right now with the GOP and with Trump. There's a lot less love for Trump fondness for Trump than I remember there being among the Fuentes subset, because they think he's not delivering, the GOP is not delivering their interests, that their economic conditions are still very difficult, even relative to not just we're all suffering, life's hard, but relative to other demographics. So hard to buy a house as a young person, to afford childcare. People are delaying families because they won't be able to afford childcare. They still have debts from student loans. That whole system needs to be scrapped and replaced. It's rapacious. And so I'm urging the GOP to pay a little bit more attention to that. Democrats seem to be coalescing around this affordability idea. It's going to get complicated as their different factions war over what the actual policy looks like. But they are talking about it in a way I'm not hearing from Republicans.
Yeah, look, I think that obviously the issue of affordability is massive, and we've seen, Zoran Mamdani, who you would obviously disagree with strongly. I would have more sympathy for him, but it was the signature issue in his campaign. I think the point about the Shapiro clip that we played and the sort of uproar that followed was, I think, to do with just a perceived lack of sympathy or empathy in his part. It's just like, well, if it's too expensive, you should just move.
In some way, that's just his tone. He just comes across that way, like robotic a little bit.
He does, I think, to a degree, but I think the problem or the danger in that approach, whether it's Ben Shapiro or anyone else, is you can sometimes seem to be sort of jumping past the actual issues. And just to mention one that I think is more prevalent, being mentioned on the left than the right, is just the increasing corporatization of rental accommodation for people. I was looking up, as I was listening to your radar, stats where the biggest corporate landlords in the country have like 100,000 units and upwards. So these are not situations where like, oh, it's very expensive to live in New York because a lot of well-paid people are there and they pay more for rent. It's to do with a broader pattern of the nature of the rental market changing. And ProPublica did a big investigation a couple of years ago about those companies colluding to keep rents elevated, which obviously makes it much harder to save to buy for a house if that's your objective.
Meanwhile, Trump's best idea on this is a 50-year mortgage.
Right.
We don't want that.
Right.
Nobody likes that idea.
Lifetime debt.
It's just ridiculous. That's more of this same kind of student loan type scam where it sounds good. Oh, I'll pay less per month, but you pay interest.
Yep.
And so if it's over long, you'll pay more in the fullness of time. And most people don't own a house for 50 years. So you'll own less of the house when you actually go to sell it. You'll have less equity,
right,
less profit. That's just a horrible idea. I mean, if people really want it that way and a private lender wants to give it to you, then it's none of my business, but the government shouldn't structure it to be offered.
No, and the amount of added interest you pay by expanding the length of the mortgage for an extra 20 years is enormous. We're not talking about like 50 grand. It's like $1 million on the median priced house of interest if it gets elongated to that degree.
Yeah, we need to get away from that. You need to, again, that's more price disguising, more confusion. Buy something and then own it. That is the dream of young people. It's a realistic dream. It's what the generations before them have wanted. And it is true in some cases economic prospects dwindle in your hometown or the place your family grew up, and you got to move somewhere else. To the extent we were all immigrants at some point, that's a choice our grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents made from the old country to here. So that is true, but that idea should be presented a little less callously, I think, and we should also work to improve things now.
Let's start in our time-honored fashion, Robby. What's on your radar?
Well, Niall, another huge win for President Trump, who calmly, rationally, and concisely explained to Fox News host Laura Ingraham why the H-1B visa program, which allows high-skilled foreign laborers to come to this country to work, is here to stay. Watch this.
H-1B visa thing will not be a big priority for your administration, because if you want to raise wages for American workers, you can't flood the country with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of foreign workers.
You also do have to bring in talent.
We have plenty of talented people here.
No, you don't.
We don't have talented people here?
No, you don't have certain talents, and people have to learn. You can't take people off an unemployment line and say, I'm going to put you into a factory where we're going to make missiles.
Trump went on to explain exactly why foreign labor is sometimes necessary.
They raided because they wanted illegal immigrants out. They had people from South Korea that made batteries all their lives. Making batteries are very complicated. It's not an easy thing. It's very dangerous. A lot of explosions, a lot of problems. They had like 500 or 600 people, early stages, to make batteries and to teach people how to do it. Well, they wanted them to get out of the country. You're going to need that, Laura. I mean, I know you and I disagree on this. You can't just say a country's coming in, going to invest $10 billion to build a plant, and going to take people off an unemployment line who haven't worked in 5 years, and they're going to start making missiles. It doesn't work that way.
Undoubtedly, some members of the MAGA coalition will be upset to hear this, but guess what? Facts don't care about your feelings. And the fact of the matter is, Trump is absolutely right about this. If we want to get serious about manufacturing in America and be less reliant on imports from foreign countries, then we need to build things here. And we're going to need skilled laborers to do it. That includes skilled immigrants. The Georgia factory example is very, very useful. In that case, South Korean immigrants had come here to help build a factory. Due to the quirks of immigration law, they were allowed to help advise on the project, but not do physical work regarding the project, possibly. Again, it's not totally clear. The law is actually somewhat vague and contradictory on what precisely they are allowed to do. Well, immigration authorities raided the factory and sent them back to Korea. These immigrants are not criminals. They are not spies. South Korea is our friend and ally against China. These immigrants were helping us build a factory so that we can do things in America. And we want to send them away? It's madness. Now look, I know there are some MAGA populists who will say, we can hire Americans to build things. We just need to pay them better. And to that I say, okay, sure. You know what? Why don't you try to build a factory and instead of getting the best deal you can for the raw materials and labor costs, you arbitrarily force yourself to pay more and have the process take longer? Obviously, that would be idiotic. And yet it's the precise demand of this faction of MAGA. Make it slower, harder, and stupider to build things. Slower, harder, stupider. That's the mantra of protectionism, in fact. You might say, well, what if it takes longer or costs more to build it here? Isn't it better if we pay Americans rather than foreigners? The problem is you could use that logic to apply to really anything, consumer electronics, furniture, clothing, food. You want to pay a lot more for it so you can feel the moral superiority of knowing it was crafted by American hands. That's really just an evolved form of the left progressive buy local argument, which has long tried to argue that we should prefer food that is grown locally or clothing that is stitched together locally. I actually used to encounter this argument in college all the time. Guess what? The hippies of Ann Arbor were wrong then, and they're wrong now, even if they've started wearing MAGA hats, I guess. Look, even Kristi Noem, the nation's foremost authority on deportations, she understands why skilled immigration is important.
What is the administration's position on these visas?
No, we're going to keep using our visa programs. We're just going to make sure that they have integrity, that we're actually doing the vetting of the individuals who come into this country, that they want to be here for the right reasons, that they're not supporters of terrorists and organizations that hate America. And that's what I think is so remarkable is under the Trump administration, we've sped up our process and added integrity to the visa programs, to green cards, to all of that. But also more people are becoming naturalized under this administration than ever before.
Noem is exactly right. We should vet the immigrants. We should make sure they share our values and that they want to work. If you're coming to the U.S. looking for a handout or planning to commit crimes or simping for terrorists, then our borders are closed to you. But if you want to help make America a better place and grow our economy, then welcome to the team. And the factory that the South Koreans were working on is a really clear example of, I think, where this just goes all awry in terms of the mass deportation scenario. They were brought here on visas to advise on this project, and then the technical distinction about whether you're advising other people on how to build something and then or actually assisting them in building it. I mean, come on. That's starting to get like really stupid government malfeasance. And they were wrongfully deported, and now there are delays to build that factory. I mean, like, you want to build things here, this is what it takes. And Trump said, I love when Trump just speaks the truth to people sometimes and is like, look, I'm sorry, I know you want it all to be Americans, but that's not cost efficient, so it's not how it's going to be. And I appreciate that candor from the president. So,
first of all, I appreciated the phrase, the hippies of Ann Arbor, in your radar.
My old friends.
Great band.
Yes.
Preferred their earlier work. No, anyway, it's, look, I think there are two separate points on the immigration debate as it pertains to these kinds of visas. One is a debate about skills, and another is a debate about wages. I, of course, like I think most people should think that it is best for the United States or any country to draw the people with the skills that it needs to inside its borders so that those skills can be harnessed to the country's advantage. And I would argue, in fact, that one of the failings of our immigration system is that it isn't particularly overall tailored to the country's needs.
It's not.
Now, that to me is a separate issue from importing workers because they will work for lower wages. I think you like that because you think it's more market efficient. I dislike it because I think it hollows out protections for workers and tries to, or gets into a kind of race to the bottom. That's the objection I have here. I do agree that the situation in the factory in Georgia was pretty absurd. I mean, those people were openly there. It was a bit of a distinction without a difference as to what they were doing, what they were purportedly doing wrong. It doesn't seem to me they were doing anything pretty wrong. That was just a kind of debacle.
Right, and then people will say, but the the government of the state of Georgia gave the Hyundai money to build that factory, for the purpose of employing Americans, when the factory's running. They did not promise in the building of the factory be only American labor to do it, because that might cost 3 times or 10 times more. And I can't take seriously people who like you should consciously choose to spend more when a different labor pool is available. Now, I understand your issue about wages. That to me speaks to, it certainly is unfair to American laborers if because of the law, employers are required to pay them or treat them differently or better because of labor protections for them. And then there's this also competing pool of labor that is more efficient for the employer. Well, that's actually not fair to the American labor. So that I agree is wrong and should be gotten away with. That speaks to the need to have those people who have an illegal status have some kind of legal status so that then it's not unfair competition. They're entitled to whatever the protections are that the American workers are getting, and then you wouldn't have that inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
I'm all for that, yeah.
Right, exactly. The danger is people being essentially indentured servants.
Right, we don't want that.
That's obviously a problem.
Yeah.